Good morning to both those in the studio audience and to those watching in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon or good evening to those around the world. My name is Franklin Kramer. I'm an Atlantic Council board member, and it's my honor to welcome the Honorable Ambassador Katherine Tai, the 19th United States Trade Representative, and Secretary General Wamkele Mene of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Welcome to the Council for each of you for the special Atlantic Council front page event. In addition, we also have Ambassador Sergei Mamboli from the Republic of Congo, who's also the Dean of the Africa Diplomatic Corps here in the United States. The front page events hosted by the Council are a premier platform for discussions with global leaders, and recent events have included, among others, Christine Lagarde, who's the President of the European Central Bank, President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, President Emmanuel Macron of France, Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Janet Yellen, and President Isaac Herzog of Israel. The Atlantic Council is a nonpartisan organization. It's now 61 years old, and it's driven by its mission of shaping the global future together. The Council undertakes to support and even galvanize U.S. leadership and engagement in the world, in partnership with allies and with partners to shape solutions to global challenges. Africa, its nations, and its people have a critical role to play in achieving such solutions. We're therefore very pleased to have this discussion around the future of U.S.-Africa trade. It's a timely discussion. It's just 7 days before the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit hosted by the Biden-Harris administration, in which, of course, Ambassador Tai will play a key role. I think all of those in this room and also online can recognize that there are significant challenges ongoing in our globalized world. Security and economics are more closely linked, as Secretary Yellen has stated. The impact, for example, of the Russia-Ukraine war on energy, on food, on other markets is illustrative. Supply chain dependencies have become of ever greater concern, and resolving global climate change and health concerns are of increasing importance. But those requirements for change also offer opportunities, including, as I've said, for African nations and people. And just illustratively, climate change, for example, will depend heavily on renewables, and Africa is well positioned to take advantage of wind and of solar. Green hydrogen will be a key factor likely in the transition from hydrocarbons. And as the International Energy Agency has stated, Africa can play a leading role in green hydrogen's development and supply. Critical minerals, also likewise essential to the new economy, and Africa can be not only a source and a processor, but with the right support, a producer of end products, such as batteries for which critical minerals are required. All that will require a combination of private sector activities and governmental actions. And one key governmental framework for Africa is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The free trade area promises deepening economic integration. It creates a single market for goods and services for almost 1.3 billion people across Africa. 54 African Union members have signed the agreement, 42 members have ratified it, and 39 have deposited their instruments of ratification. The Secretary General will be able to discuss the way forward. The United States intends to fully engage with Africa, as the recent Africa strategy says, in a 21st century U.S.-Africa partnership. And one aspect of that is friendshoring, which is to say working with reliable partners. Africa's nations and people certainly can be part of that. Josh Lipsky, head of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, is in the audience, and he and his colleagues have done significant work on friendshoring, as have our Geoenergy Center. Ambassador Tai is, of course, at the heart of all such engagements, as trade, investment, and financing will be critical. So I look forward to hearing from the Secretary General and from Ambassador Tai on how Africa and the United States can best work together. And at the Atlantic Council, the Africa Center will spearhead continuous complementary work as it relates to both business, security, people, and including, for example, the global Africa diaspora and beyond industry for things like creative and cultural industries. So let me stop there and turn the proceedings over to our Senior Director of the Africa Center, Ambassador Rama Yade, to start the conversation. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Secretary Kramer. The Africa Center is honored by your welcoming and opening remarks. Thank you very much. You have served as a senior political appointee in 2 administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And in the nonprofit world, you have been a senior fellow at CNA, chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C., a distinguished research fellow at the Center for Technology and National Security Policy of the National Defense University, and an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. And you have also written extensively. Secretary Franklin, thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you both.
Welcome, Ambassador Katherine Tai. Ambassador, you are, like Secretary Kramer said, the 19th United States trade representative, one of the most prominent members of the US cabinet. As a member of the President's cabinet, you are the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on US trade policy. You have been unanimously confirmed by the Senate. And prior to that, you spent most of your career in public service, serving as Chief Trade Counsel and Trade Subcommittee Staff Director for the House, Ways and Means Committee in the United States Congress. And you are also an experienced World Trade Organization litigator. Ambassador Tai, welcome in the Atlantic Council studios on our highest platform. Today, you will be in a conversation, we can see him, a unique conversation with Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Secretary General, you occupy an incredibly important position in the African landscape, present and future. You were elected by the 33rd Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union. And prior to that, you served in South Africa as Chief Director at the Department of Trade and Industry, where you served, you were the South Africa's Director at the Department of Trade. And you were the Chief Trade Negotiator in the African Free Trade Area. And during your tenure, South Africa ratified both the African Trade Area and the tripartite FTAs agreements, providing new export markets in fast-growing and dynamic markets in East and West Africa. You also represented South Africa at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Your parcours and journey is very similar to Ambassador Tai. And we are very happy to welcome you today in the Atlantic Council studio for this important fireside chat. Welcome. And allow me to greet the Dean of the African Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador of Congo, here in Washington, D.C., His Excellency Serge Mombouli, and the prominent members of the Geoeconomic Center led by Josh Lipsky, my colleague of the Council. For our audience, feel free to please ask your questions in the chat. I hope to have enough time at the end of this conversation to give the floor to our virtual audience. So this discussion comes on the eve of the US-Africa Leaders Summit, which will advance the US-African collaboration on today's most pressing global priorities and challenges. This is the first in 8 years. So my first question will be for you, Ambassador Tai. You will be one of the most significant part of this gathering. What do you plan to say to the maybe 45 African heads of states and governments who will visit Washington between December 13 and 15?
So it's a delight to be here with you in person today, and it's wonderful to see the Secretary General on the screen. I am so looking forward to the Leaders Week here, which is coming up in a week and a half, and I think that this is the perfect warm-up event. Let me say this. I think that this Leaders Summit that President Biden is hosting is coming at a really important time in the world economy, but a really important time in our relationship with Africa, the entire continent. I think that the focus really is on partnership and within that partnership, an orientation towards the future. Anyone, I think, who listens to President Biden when he talks about the United States and his vision for the U.S. role in the world is about an affirmative and positive vision. He is a deeply optimistic person. And so even in the midst of a very challenging global economic landscape, a lot of challenges facing our people, the focus of certainly the economic program in this summit will be on the future, unlocking the potential of our relationship, but most importantly, the potential of our people.
Secretary Mene, you are joining us from where exactly? Because you are virtual, but if it is not too confidential, you will tell us where you speak from and where you are going. Because my first question will be your reaction to Ambassador Tai's first thoughts on the next summit. I would like to know if you will attend the summit of mid-December, and what is your first appreciation of Ambassador Tai's project during that important gathering?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Ambassador, for being our moderator today, and I want to thank also Right Honorable Ambassador Tai for inviting me to this session, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us, and I want to also recognize the Dean of the African Diplomatic Corps, who is, I understand, is with you in studio. I am in Accra. I will soon be in Washington, D.C. In about 5 days' time for this truly historic occasion that the President of the United States, President Biden administration, will host my leaders, the Assembly of Heads of States and Government, or a majority of them anyway, and I will be there to support them. I think it is a very important discussion that we will have. The leaders will talk about a range of different issues, peace and security, climate change, how to deepen the relationship between the United States and the African continent. From my point of view, I think it will be a very important opportunity to provide an update not only to the U.S. government, because we've had several interactions, but to provide an update to the U.S. business and private sector about the African Continental Free Trade Area, the opportunities that it presents to the business community in the United States for investment in Africa, for job creation in Africa, spurring on innovation in Africa, but more importantly, how the AFCFTA can enable further U.S. engagement with the African continent, and so it comes really at a very critical time, as was mentioned in the opening remarks. It comes at a time when we see a crisis with the Ukraine-Russia war. A crisis that itself began as the world was beginning to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, as the African continent was beginning to focus on economic recovery and long-term resilience. And so I think the world is incredibly challenged to be more innovative about how the tools that we deploy at times of crisis such as this. And from our point of view, trade, investment is a very important, if not the most important tool for us to come out of these crises. And so I hope that the summit will be an opportunity for us to exchange views on trade and investment and business opportunities, on climate change. All of these are very important areas which I know the United States and the African continent and the African Union in general, we have similar values in how to approach these challenges.
Thank you, Secretary Mene. We are looking forward to meeting with you in Washington when you will be there in a few days. Ambassador Tai, you have heard your colleague mentioning that the Africa free trade area has been hit by the pandemic and the consequences of the war in Ukraine. At the very beginning, under the trade agreement, tariffs on 90% of goods were supposed to be phased out over 10 years and more for the remaining 10%. And this is being done in stages. But do you think this process is now questioned because of these consequences? And what could be done, or what could the US do to support the free trade area in Africa and avoid the impact, the negative impact of these historical challenges?
So in terms of the impacts of the pandemic, the Russian war against Ukraine, the economic and human impacts, that is something that we share. I think that everyone in the world economy, being as connected as we are all suffering and poorer for a pandemic phenomenon, and then also a geopolitical tension that has developed into very, very serious consequences. So I don't know that we can avoid that. I think that we have to accept that these are part of the multiple challenges that we are facing. What I want to say is it actually reinforces all of the conviction that we have had since the beginning of this administration, which is that, let me lean into and borrow the phraseology from the Secretary General, which is we are in real need of innovation in terms of our economic tools, and our economic policy tools absolutely includes our trade tools. And I think that trade is incredibly powerful because it is about not just what we do for ourselves. You can't just trade with yourself. It is about working together with others in pursuit of a vision. And I absolutely agree. I think we have very similar values and a similar commitment to advancing and evolving the conversation around global trade and, frankly, globalization. In terms of the relationship between the United States and Africa as a continent, every one of these challenges presents us with an opportunity to figure out how we do the things that we have already been doing better, but then how we carve out the space to be responsive to all of the challenges that we see ahead of us, whether it is with respect to the climate crisis, about navigating towards an economic recovery, building resilience into global supply chains, looking at regionalization, regional linkages very strategically, and then always around inclusivity. And that inclusivity is both with respect to our own economies, but also our economies as we put them together. How do we do better in our economic engagement inside and outside to bring everyone along and to leave fewer people behind?
You used, Ambassador Tai, this important word, inclusivity. On the youngest continent of the world, it's very important to create jobs. 16 million jobs per year, every year, are needed, requested on the continent. Allow me to ask an important question about that to Secretary Mene. Secretary Mene, we know the importance of lower taxes to have more competition, to create more opportunities on the continent, to create jobs for these African youth. And we know how the war in Ukraine has questioned the plan you had of lowering these taxes on the products. So my question is, how has the African free trade area adapted to this situation? How the guidelines have been revised to be able to keep the goal of creating jobs for the young Africans?
Well, I think we are just coming from a summit of African heads of states, the Assembly of Heads of States and Government that was held in Niamey in Niger a little less than 2 weeks ago. And the outcome of that summit is our heads of states reiterated and recommitted to reducing barriers to intra-Africa trade, reducing barriers to intra-Africa investment, and making sure that we use trade as an instrument of resilience, as Ambassador Tai eloquently described. How do we deploy trade to make sure that we see the long-term resilience that we want to see? And so rather than actually reducing or moving much slower, reducing the speed of implementation of the AFCFTA and the commitments that were made at tariff reduction, non-tariff barrier reduction, elimination rather, actually our heads of states recommitted to move much, much faster and to make sure that even the number of countries that have ratified, which is now 44 countries who have ratified the agreement establishing the AFCFTA, that we have all African countries who will live up to the legal commitments to reduce and eliminate barriers to intra-Africa trade and investment. And so the target, which is, as you described earlier, the target, which is 90% of trade in Africa by year 15 must be at zero duty, that target still remains. And the target to open the services sector from a regulatory point of view and also from a point of view of open markets, of market access, that target also remains. Similarly, our targets in the area of, in the other 3 protocols, investment, competition, intellectual property rights, they have just, the heads of states noted the conclusion of these protocols, which are equally important to building a more resilient common market. So the commitment remains. Now, to your point about the role of young people, on the African continent, we have young people who are actually at the cutting edge of, for example, digital technological innovation. We have young people who in Rwanda, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, who are truly at the cutting edge of digital innovation and enabling electronic commerce and digital commerce to take place in Africa. And so with the introduction of a protocol on women and youth in trade, we want to make sure that we have an inclusive market on the continent, that we have an inclusive economy, that the AFCFTA is not just about large corporations. I'm not suggesting for a moment that they should not benefit, but we must focus on young people, on small, medium enterprises that are run by women. In Africa, over 60% of Africa's GDP, the contribution comes from small, medium enterprises. In many, many border communities, the drivers of commerce in those border communities and the drivers of trade across those borders are small, medium enterprises that are run by women. And so what this suggests to us in very, very stark terms is that we've got to change the nature of trade agreements and not only focus on large corporations, which they should benefit, but we must take concrete action to benefit young people to benefit small medium enterprises. Small medium enterprises in Africa create over 450 million jobs. And the bulk of that 450 million jobs are young Africans. And so next year, by June, we will conclude the protocol on women and youth in trade, the first of its kind in the world, which will codify the legal into legally binding obligations, the aspirations that we have for inclusivity of trade agreements, for inclusivity of young people in trade agreements and its benefits, and for inclusivity of small medium enterprises. All of these important aspirations, we are well poised to codify them into legally binding commitments for our governments in Africa to implement these legally binding commitments in their own countries in a manner that creates a more inclusive trade regime, a trade regime in Africa that is responsive to and recognizes the drivers of Africa's economy. And so I think that we have a very unique opportunity to make sure that we change the narrative of trade and focus on inclusivity rather than only on market access. And I believe that when we have small medium enterprises that are led by women and young people at the center of this trade agreement, we will see the inclusivity that we want to see. In September, we hosted, along with Her Excellency President Samia Suluhu Hassan, Her Excellency the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, we hosted the first of its kind in Africa, a conference on women and youth in trade. And it was not just about identifying challenges, which is important. We took the opportunity to hear directly from young entrepreneurs what are the barriers that you are confronted with and what are the challenges that we can confront together, and what are the solutions that we can present to our heads of states and government so that we begin to change the last 60 years or so of exclusion of young people from mainstream economic activity, exclusion of small medium enterprises from mainstream economic activity, to make them partners in the implementation of this agreement. And this is what I reported to the heads of states and government when we met in Niamey less than 2 weeks ago, that we are now on this march of inclusivity, and that the protocol on women and youth in trade is the first step of this journey for inclusivity in trade.
Secretary Mene, you mentioned quickly the role of large companies. We'll go back there later, and we'll mention the role of African SMEs. But before, I would like to ask a question to Ambassador Tai about what you said on innovation. When Africa trades with each other, it adds value and makes innovation. Yet when it trades abroad, when Africa trades abroad, it often trades with raw materials. You know, despite the digital revolution we all know happened in Africa these last two decades. What is, Ambassador Tai, what is the nature of the United States interest in supporting the Africa Free Trade Area? Let me say that in a different way. It is known that the main export markets of many African traders are currently in the US or the United Kingdom because of the importance of import taxes on the African continent, and other costs make goods too expensive to sell in Africa. So the jobs are not created on the African continent. So Africa exports its jobs, and probably to the United States. Why would you want then, as an American, change that?
Oh, wow. All right. Let me take 2 steps back and just say I think that when the Secretary General is speaking, we've got a tight, angle just on him. But which is a good thing for me because I find this to be true when we meet in person, when we're on Zooms in this context as well. As he talks about his vision for implementing the AFCFTA, I turn into a bobblehead, really. I can't stop nodding. There's so much that I agree with him about and I'm inspired by, but in terms of not just what he's doing for the African continent, but in terms of a vision for where we would like to go. So before I get to your specific question, let me also say on the point of innovation, this protocol on women and youth, that is an innovation in trade policy. The version of globalization that we live in right now has been very powerful and very successful in many ways. And one of those ways has been in just expanding the size of the pie. The challenge that we're facing is that in expanding that pie, this version of globalization hasn't done a great job in terms of sharing the pie. So the bigs have gotten bigger, the bigs have done really well, and the smalls and the mediums, whether they are enterprises or whether they are people, the ordinary people, I think that there's a lot of potential that we have left to deliver through trade. So part of what I am really excited about is partnering with the Secretary General, with all of my counterparts on the African continent, to unlock this innovation around how do we make trade policy more inclusive, truly across the board? How do we, in many ways, democratize the opportunity that we're creating? So we're mindful that in creating the pie, the point is that everyone has more opportunity to share in the pie. On your point about raw materials, I definitely want to get into that as well. So I often talk about this vision for innovation in trade policy, evolution in trade policy, moving from one version of globalization to a new version, a new version that's built to promote sustainability, resilience, and inclusivity. What I'm reminded by is that these are not the only 2 versions of globalization. For as long as we have been trading with each other, we have evolved through many versions of globalization. And of course, I think that in many of the previous versions, there has been a very unequal and imbalanced relationship between resource-rich countries that are looking for development opportunity and those who are more advanced on the development scale. I think that this facilitation in bringing about a new version of globalization, that inclusivity piece also means turning some of these previous dynamics on their head. And I go to the opening remarks that were made, which is the vision going forward is not to continue this, I've got the technologies, you've got the resources kind of relationship, but thinking strategically about and intentionally about fostering supply chains, true partnerships between economies, between the United States and the African Continental project, making us better partners and ensuring that supply chains are resilient, make sense, and that we all have pieces in the different parts of the supply chain, from the lower value all the way up to the higher value. We have to share those links in the supply chain as well. And I think that that is also an area where the partnership between the United States and Africa, this is a concept that I am very eager to prove with our partners in Africa.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. To continue this, what you are just mentioning, you belong to the new generation who wants to build on a partner with a partnership dimension with African countries. So Secretary Mene, Ambassador Tai can do her part, as she obviously explains. On your end, as African now, you also have some challenges to address. How can you, or what do you do to address the problems created by Africans themselves through the multiple organizations or regional blocs, such as the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, and you have ECOWAS in West Africa, you have the SADC, you have so many regional organizations on the African continent that can challenge what you are doing through this large free trade area. How can you address this important challenge in the way the African continent is shaped?
Well, first, let me just say how wholeheartedly I agree with Ambassador Tai on the last point of productive capacity building and productive capacity interventions for export. I think that is absolutely critical. We have many challenges. You mentioned one of them, and that is the multiplicity of regional economic communities, which many of them have existed for the last 50, 60 years or so. The African Union has a very clear objective of integration of the continent. And in the Abuja Treaty, in the Lagos Plan of Action, it's very clear that, and also, mind you, in the thinking of the founding mothers and fathers of the Organization of African Unity, that one day the African continent will and has to achieve economic integration. That economic integration cannot be achieved if we continue in our regional silos. So the framework that the AFCFTA provides is integration between West Africa and East Africa, North Africa and Southern Africa, and so on and so on. So that when the trade happens, when the investment happens, it happens across regions. And so the work that we are doing, our mandate is complementary to the mandates of the regional economic communities. In accordance with the treaties that I just mentioned, the Abuja Treaty, the treaty establishing the Organization of African Unity, in accordance with the provisions of these treaties, I do foresee that when, for example, Africa becomes a customs union, which is an objective of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government, when Africa becomes a customs union, that the regional economic communities, their mandate will have to adjust to that reality of an African union, customs union. And so there will be adjustments that will have to be made to take account of a progression in the integration of the market in Africa. The regional economic communities will continue to have their role. Many of them are focusing, if not all of them, are correctly focusing on intra-regional economic trade. So that is boosting trade within ECOWAS, boosting trade within the East African community. I think that role will continue, and I think it should. But when it comes to cross-regional trade, that the AFCFTA presents that legal instrument and that legal framework for that trade to happen at preferential terms, and also provides the platform for elimination of duties, elimination of non-tariff barriers, elimination of barriers to intra-Africa investment. So that's what the AFCFTA does. It is complementarity. For the first time, and this underscores the point that you are making, for the first time, Africa has a single set of rules of origin. We have now agreed up to 88.3% rules of origin. The only area where we are still not yet agreed, where we are negotiating, is the automotive sector and the area of textiles and clothing. Every other economic, every other product that is traded since the entry into force of the AFCFTA, we have a single rule of origin. 10 years ago, if you were trading from West Africa with your counterparty in East Africa, the rules of origin that applied were MFN rules. Yeah. That is to say, there was no preferential treatment. Now we have a single set of rules for all of these products, close to 5,000 products that we have agreed. When you trade in Africa, we apply the same rule. Mm-hmm. This is good for economic operators. This is good for exporters. Mm-hmm. It is good for investors. Because if you are an investor, the last thing you want to see is rules of origin that are different in every region of the continent, depending on where you want to export to within the continent. Now, as a result of the AFCFTA, you will be able to export from East Africa to West Africa to Southern Africa using exactly the same rules of origin, exactly the same rules for trade and investment. And that, in my view, is a very significant step forward, complementing on what the regional economic communities are focusing on in their own regions.
When I was preparing this event, Secretary Mene, I read somewhere that Kenya is a major exporter of flowers, but Nigeria imports flowers from the Netherlands. So we are at the heart of what you are explaining. Allow me, since time is running, to ask not me, but to ask a question from the chat to Ambassador Tai. An interesting question, given your background related to China. It comes from Simon Lester, who asked, how do you see U.S.-China great power competition playing out in Africa? Does the Biden administration have plans to help U.S. companies compete with Chinese companies for business on the African continent? Is it related to your portfolio, this aspect of trade?
So much of my portfolio is very big. Sometimes because my title is ambassador. Adults and children, it's a fair question, will ask me, you're an ambassador, where do you live? I'll say, well, Simon knows. Yeah. Who are you ambassador to? And I said, I'm the U.S. ambassador to the entire world. I am the trade ambassador, right? I'm a topical ambassador.
That's frightening.
Yeah.
Right? And exciting too.
So it is a huge portfolio. But let me just, because Simon is a friend, and he knows trade. Simon Lester.
Okay.
He knows trade very, very well. Let me just let the record reflect that the first mention of China did not come from either myself or Secretary Mene. So, look, let me make this point really clear. The relationship that we are pursuing in terms of partnership with the African continent, with African countries, is inherently valuable. There are so many reasons in terms of our shared history, our people connections, that we need to be doing more to unlock the potential in this partnership and for us to be supporting Secretary Mene in his incredibly important work. In terms of China, we know China has been playing a very aggressive game all over the world. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with really important, long-standing allies and trading partners who tell me, you are incredibly important to us. But at this point, our largest trading partner and our largest trading relationship is China. And I think that that is a fact that we are encountering all over the world. I think it also goes to, I mean, there are geopolitical dimensions of this, obviously, but I think that what this goes to is this current version of globalization has taken us to a place when we're talking about supply chains, just supply relationships, dependencies, concentrations. It is part of what we need to adjust and rebalance across the board from a resilient standpoint. So, is it a factor? Yes, it is. Do we need to be, as the United States, playing a much more engaged role with the rest of the world? Do we need to be innovating in how we bring our political and economic philosophy and values to creating that economic interoperability, creating the types of opportunities that we value so much here, that we would like to see around the world? Yes, no, absolutely. But is that the driving force for why we should be interested in Africa? Absolutely not. There are 1 million reasons why the U.S.-Africa relationship on its own requires our maximum attention.
I think Simon is happy with this very eloquent answer. I would like to ask our guest, Secretary Mene, and take a question from the audience. Mr. Mensah, Spiro Mensah, says, trade is indeed a very powerful development tool, as we all said. However, trade between unequal partners can create more development problems. Will the summit agenda address this issue, according to you? Well,
I think that the way Ambassador Tai framed it in a large respect responds to that question, because the underlying framework of globalization and a subset of globalization trade agreements must take account of the need to address inequality. And that's why it is so very, very important that when we are discussing a future trade relationship with anybody, not just the United States, we must take account of these asymmetries. And these asymmetries, and by the way, there are asymmetries not only between developed and developing countries. There are asymmetries amongst developing countries. There are asymmetries on the African continent. That's why we have taken a number of concrete steps to address those inequalities, those asymmetries within the African continent. We have said, for example, special and differential treatment for least developed countries, recognition of the unique circumstances of small island developing states on either side of Africa's coastline, whether in the west coast it is Cabo Verde, or in the east coast it is the Comore Islands and the Seychelles and others. Landlocked countries, we have devised special rules that will enable that recognition to be taken account of at law, so that the asymmetry, we have differentials in levels of economic development. We have a country that has a GDP per capita of $110. We have on the other extreme a country that has a GDP per capita of $25,000. But all of these countries have been able to craft a trade agreement that has far-reaching obligations from the point of view of a country's economy and industrial development trajectory. And so, whilst I do absolutely take the point that there are symmetries, obviously, between developing and developed countries, but the point that Ambassador Tai made about how do we reconfigure this relationship in a way that is mutually beneficial to reflect a new form of globalization, I think is absolutely critical. In the same way that we've had to do that here on the African continent to take account of that same reality of asymmetries. It may be in different ways, but certainly the asymmetries are there. We have introduced the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund, which is a fund that will enable countries as they reduce and eliminate their duties or tariffs. Many countries, for many countries, duties and tariffs are important for the fiscus. And so if you eliminate your duties, where do you get the fiscal support? So we've introduced the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund in recognition of these asymmetries, and the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund, with the support of Afrexim Bank, has been capitalized thus far with a seed capital amount of $1 billion. We will mobilize more so that the countries that are in this bracket of an asymmetry, they have access to a facility that will direct investment in productive sectors. Productive sectors that will enable them, the countries, to take advantage of open access, open markets on the African continent. I visited, for example, a plant in Lesotho that manufactures car seats. This plant, they want to expand their market. And by the way, they employ 700 people. 60% to 70% of them are women who are highly skilled, highly trained, well-paid, decent jobs. The facility would be for an entity such as that to enable that company or that entity to expand its business, to export to the rest of the African continent, to export to the rest of the world. That's how we are devising strategies through concrete actions that we've taken to deal with some of these inequalities and these asymmetries amongst countries in terms of level of industrial development and in terms of export capacity. And so we will, of course, approach the relationship, any other relationship, with that frame of mind. That let us have inclusivity and inclusive benefits in all that we are doing.
Thank you, Secretary Mene. Ambassador Tai, I'm going to read another question from an anonymous attendee about the role of the Congress. What strikes me the most in the U.S. is the way the U.S. policy, foreign policy, is built with an important role for the Congress, which is very different from what we have, for example, in France, where the president has the leadership on the U.S. policy, on the French policy to Africa. So the question here is, Ambassador Tai, how do you think members of Congress should engage with African trade partners with he said, with AGOA Summit? You see, AGOA Summit. It's not an AGOA Summit, but the importance of this topic of trade is so big that this is mentioned here. What topics, issues, areas should Congress bring to the table that African trade ministers look forward to hearing about?
This is a really good question because you're right. The way that we do trade in the United States reflects the fact that for us, and I think this is true for everyone, trade sits at the intersection of foreign policy and domestic economic policy. And the way that's reflected in our Constitution is the authority for foreign affairs is given to the executive branch. You have to speak for the entire country at once, so that makes sense. But the authority for foreign commerce and commerce, including foreign commerce, is given to the legislative branch. And I think this reflects something that Secretary General Mene mentioned, which is, traditionally, trade was quite often about tariffs, and tariffs are a revenue tool. I think it reflects the domestic economic policy and foreign policy intersection that trade has the power to impact, and also impacts our decisions on trade policy. So, I know the question was, how should Congress engage, and members of Congress should engage? My answer to that is just yes. Members of Congress, if it occurs to them, if they've got interest in trade, engage with Africa on these issues. Now, it makes perfect sense that the question moves on to AGOA, because AGOA is our existing trade program with the African continent. It's a preference program where through the Congress, and it's reauthorized intermittently, takes a sector of goods and provides duty-free preferential access into the U.S. market on the theory that this access will stimulate development for our developing country partners. And of course, there are important criteria that apply, labor criteria, on worker rights, this program is really important, is foundational, and has been around for a long time. We were just talking, I was speaking to our Dean of the African Diplomatic Corps earlier. He knows, he's been around in Washington for 25 years. In terms of AGOA, it is so important to have it, and yet, every time it comes up for reauthorization and we look at the utilization rates, we see that there is so much economic value that conceptually should be there that is left on the table. So I would really encourage our members of Congress as they are looking at the tail end of this period of reauthorization for AGOA. It lasts until 2025. To really work with us in the executive branch and the administration, work with our partners, to push ourselves to see if there is economic value here in our existing program. What can we do to actually reap the benefits of this? How can we track whether or not the investments that we are looking to foster through these preferences will actually be made, and then what more can we be doing? And as we are looking at 2025 for this program, but also for the economies on the African continent that are developing, that are pushing into middle income and looking at how to push out of that middle income trap ceiling, let us also think about what comes after AGOA, and look at our existing tool set to see what is fit for purpose, and then push ourselves again on innovation to think through how can we approach this incredibly rich relationship in terms of economic potential, and how can we crack this nut is going to be really important for where we go in the future. As you've commented, the youth in Africa, the youngness of the African population, that means that the future is Africa. And this is important for Africa and also for us. One final comment, because I know we're running up against time. Secretary Mene mentioned rules of origin. I think people with technical trade backgrounds like us know how important this technical operation of rules in trade agreements, especially around tariff liberalization, how important it is. I think that in terms of driving this innovation into the next version of globalization, this is an area that needs a lot more attention, and I'm looking forward to working with Secretary General Mene to find a way to talk about rules of origin that doesn't make everybody else's eyes glaze over. So again, I want to say thank you. So much of these jobs, in trade especially, but just in general, so much of it is about showing up. I want to thank Secretary Mene in advance for showing up soon in the U.S., leading into and through the Leaders Summit. And I just want to say I made my first trip as USTR to the continent earlier this year in the fall, to Kenya. It is my turn to come visit you, and I look forward to showing up for you the next time.
Perfect conclusion. You did it for me. Thank you, Ambassador. But I'm curious, before, when we were preparing this event with your wonderful team, they insisted a lot on the diaspora. You would like to include in your work, in your mission.
Thank you.
I'm curious, how will you do you want to do that?
Yes.
Very briefly, because I know we
Certainly. This is part of the vision that we have in terms of our collaboration between USTR and the AFCFTA Secretariat, is not only to put together our wonky trade minds and try to push innovation, but to put certainly our businesses together, as the Secretary General mentioned, but more importantly, as part of the innovation, to bring our stakeholders together. And a hugely important part of our shared stakeholder resource is our diaspora communities. In economic policy, I remain convinced, and especially in trade, the benefits that you are generating, the point is to have those benefits for your people, that our economies are not large, faceless concepts. Our economies are made up of our people. And I think on that, I am particularly inspired and feel extremely fortunate to have a partner like Secretary General Mene.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tai. A last word, Secretary Mene, before we say goodbye.
Well, let me first very much thank Ambassador Tai for her kind words to me and to the work that we're trying to do here. Without the support of the United States, I think this work would be even more difficult. We will sign an MOU on the margins of the summit, and that MOU is a legal document. But we started working together before the signature of the MOU, and so I truly appreciate the commitment that she has to work and partner with us. I am very much looking forward to being in Washington. I am not looking forward to being in the cold, but I'm looking forward to being in Washington over a very, very important period when our leaders will be exchanging views and collaboration on an important partnership between the US and the African continent. This is a matter that just less than 2 weeks ago, the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union reminded us of its importance, and I know that all of them are looking forward to it. And so thank you very much, and we shall see you in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Secretary Mene, and thank you for mentioning the MOU in Accra, because that was the question by a Washington correspondent here from Jeune Afrique and Africa Report, Julien Piquet. He has a question about that, so thank you very much. So now I have to close this. I don't know how to say about this very, very inspiring conversation. It was a wonderful duet, and between two young leaders of the new generation. Ambassador Tai, you managed to turn a very technical issue into a very exciting vision with operational action. So thank you for that, and good luck in your mission. Thank you for being with us today, Secretary Mene from Accra, and we are looking forward to meet you too here in Washington, D.C., and we wish you the best of luck for the next summit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.